Thanks very much, everyone, for being here and for lending me your ears. Okay, so I'm going to show you the plan for today, but just to say, it looks a lot longer than it is, I think. So, I mean, it looks like this will be longer than this, but it's not. So I'm going to basically tell you about the third and fourth step in this four-step program towards letter freedom that I've been telling you about, and I'll say more about what I mean by that in a moment. And so 1 and 2 will take up a lot of the time, and then I thought I would do, so the rest is kind of a little bit more off the cuff, or the middle bit is more off the cuff. I wanted to pick up some, basically I'll touch on some things that I think have come up in discussion, and then that'll lead naturally into saying a little bit about how philosophy of temporal experience may be relevant here, and I will suggest there's 2 ways that it might be relevant. One kind of more obvious, maybe the other one having to do with something else that I happen to have worked on, which I'll tell you about briefly at the end. So what this is it'll be about kind of what I have and we all have been meaning by the A-B distinction all along, and I will suggest that there is some connection to temporal experience there too. And then I'll conclude. So, and roughly these are, I put up the, articles that are relevant to what I'm talking about. Oh, and so in the middle of this, of course, there will be this bit on the article by Ismail, and I mean, given the timing, I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just present all of it and then we go into discussion, or I don't know, or maybe you can see how it goes. I'm very happy for you to ask me questions about that article, about my reply. I think it will fit in with what we're doing, or what I'm doing here today. And yeah, let's see whether it happens in the middle or at the end is fine with me. Either is fine with me. Okay, so back to the beginning, A versus B, theoretic models of time or views of time, dynamic versus non-dynamic ones. Remember, even though I like these kind of views that claim to find dynamicity and passage in the block universe, and that's what I'll be talking about in a moment, I set this up like this from the start so that we know, at least at the start, what we're talking about in some sense. Like, there is something that A theorists posit there, like some metaphysical privilege that is transferred from time to time, very roughly speaking. And B theorists don't say that, right? Anti-realists don't posit tense facts, and they think of now and present and past as merely perspectival terms, right? Okay, so this is the distinction to begin with. Now, kind of to go over some of the motivations. So, as you'll see in a moment, this ineffability view is sort of, philosophically quite radical, and so you might wonder why. And I wanted to kind of summarize this here. I'll have a slide later as well, kind of an overview of motivations. So to begin with, as you saw in the first talk, I have some kind of meta-ontological puzzlement of my own. I have some, sympathies with what have been called skeptical views of temporal ontology and so on. However, I don't feel like I can really philosophically honestly say that I don't understand the question of dynamicity. I think, it's not opposed, it's not a merely verbal dispute or anything of the sort. And I suggested that I'm not the only one in this position, that there's generally has been some indecision in the broadly naturalistic camp between what I call the official B theory versus this meta-B stance, which we talked about yesterday, which basically steps outside of the dispute altogether, says it's just not helpful to trade in A terminology. Whereas I say the B theory denies that time passes in the A-theoretic sense. So, and I said something about an explanatory project like Callender's, where I see that as an illustration of this indecision, or if you like, fuzziness in the subject matter. So that's kind of one thing that's driving me to this view. And then the other motivation is that I have always liked these tenseless passage views that kind of find dynamicity within the block universe. I find them in very diverse places. We can talk about that as well. And I take them, however, to have an unresolved problem that worries me more now than it used to. And so all of that is why I go in this direction of ineffability. Now, before I tell you more about tenseless passage, I already said, I say there are views that claim to find dynamicity or passage in the block universe. Let me briefly recap something about the motivations there as well, though. Like I said last time, TP approaches want to transcend the AB dichotomy, in other words, to overcome it without dismissing it, which to my mind sort of is the natural result of kind of embracing this inherent tension that we saw between meta B and B. So, or another way to put that is, TP is a first order response. It is saying something to participants of this, AB dispute. It is a metaphysical view about time, or wants to be, I think, and yet it is roughly in the letter-free spirit. So it retains key advantages of meta B, I think, including what I talked about yesterday, where I think TP sort of dissolves some problems about temporal experience that have to do with thinking of manifest time as this one overarching kind of model. I think that TP does all this. Now, here are some examples of where I see it in the literature. Steve Savitt said, amongst other things, let's think about how representation works. In a nutshell, we don't need an animated picture to have a picture of animation. You get the sort of idea, somehow a limit to what can be displayed in the CD.
Does he think that we need to have a picture of animation to have an animated picture, conversely?
Interesting. Probably. Okay, so what's meant by this is, in order to have a view that says yes, time is dynamic in a way that space isn't, in every way in which we can imagine that it might be. We don't need, basically, to have this atheoretic transfer of metaphysical privilege. That's what I would take him to be saying. So in answer to your question, if we want to be atheorists, then we will be affirming that time passes, just on this setup. But the point is that the other way around doesn't hold. So far, so good. I think probably we will come back to the puzzlement that you might be feeling again. Yeah. Okay, here's a quote by Rovelli in this recent paper. There's real becoming in the universe. Things happen. The relativistic equations describe this unfolding of happenings. Each individual time-like world line describes a sequence of events, namely a specific unfolding of local becoming. Distinct local becomings are weaved to one another by the structure described by the four-dimensional pseudo-Riemannian geometry of general relativity. We can think of reality as a complex web of becoming. So I'll come back to this idea of locality, local becoming in a moment, but amongst other things I find in there also this thought that I think of as tenseless passage, that somehow in the block universe there is the dynamicity that atheorists have been after. There is all that dynamicity already there. And so I find it also in various texts by Janelle Ismail. She says, perspectival structure is recovered in the view of time subspecienitatis as explicitly relational. No structure is lost. passage, flow, and openness remain as real as the difference between nearby and far away, the distinction between up and down. The lesson is not that Parmenideans win and Heracliteans lose, it's that there is no genuine conflict. Look at it in the right way and you'll see it's all already included. And now, here's another quote just to connect this to the article we read. Again, so I'll say more about self-reference in a moment, but self-reference instability she talks about is meant to capture the sense in which the future remains for the agent perpetually open, and the passage of time dissolves openness into the fixity of fact. Okay, so let's look at that view in a little bit more detail. So the topic there is something that I've been including in the A side of things all along, namely genuine metaphysical, if you like, openness of the future, or the psychological error. And the key to understanding it, as she says, is self-reference plus a thermodynamic gradient. I'm not going to be talking too much about this second bit because it's not really key to her account, I think, but about this she says, well, so the thermodynamic gradient is itself explained in a neo-Boltzmannian way, and kind of goes into that in the article. Now, as I say in the reply, if we kind of look at how to interpret this view, sorry, as a first approximation, we can say that it's a view on which, we're explaining how A intuitions come about openness, but at the same time, we are giving meaning or literal content to the content of those A intuitions. In other words, we are saying what it can mean to have the sense that the future is genuinely open and coming into being. So, the background here, I think, is that someone like Ismail is sufficiently, naturalistic in outlook to find, the a-theoretic idea rather elusive, and so therefore wants to give it meaning using merely resources that are, if anything, on the B-theoretic side of things. So you can already see how I think, tenseless passage comes into this account. So we're giving meaning to A intuitions while also explaining how they come about. Now, that might seem a little kind of miraculous, like how can something explain something else if it's also somehow giving meaning to something. Also, how can we give meaning to something? If becoming already had meaning, or passage already had meaning, how can we give it a different one? And if it didn't, what can this mean? That's basically, I think, the problem with TP as it plays out in the context of this particular view. Nonetheless, I will summarize briefly how I reconstruct the view in my reply, just to give you a sense of how I think the idea is supposed to go. It's something like this. So, we've been talking about A versus B. These are metaphysical positions. But don't forget, there are also kind of rather metaphysically innocent views nearby, call them pre-A and pre-B. Pre-A is just the view that one has when living, not even thinking about what time is like, just the embedded view. Pre-B is the view of the universe that is invariant under transformations between internal perspectives, which means it's the view that we take, when doing physics. And these are different from their metaphysical cousins. And the idea is, I think, you start with pre-B, you include self-reference in it, meaning you realize that you, the agent, are part of what you are modeling in pre-B. There you are. And then you will see pre-B in a new way, namely finding A in it, finding that all the dynamicity, the coming into being, really was just self-reference. In other words, it was already included in the block universe. We just had, so to speak, forgotten it because we forgot that we're in it. That's the idea. And so for my purposes, it doesn't really matter for me whether we find this, the self-reference bit, convincing, in other words, whether the details of this account work, because I think the problem actually is not really to do with self-reference so much as it's a broader problem of trying to find the A passage in the block universe. So, yeah, the metaphor would be, it's as if, for Isma, it's as if pre-A and pre-B were originally two sides of the same coin, and they were seemingly pulled apart by their metaphysical cousins. But once you realize that the B theory is actually ill-defined, so she actually, thinks that the B theory is the block universe view, without quotation marks, is ill-defined. It's sort of an intellectual mirage. There's no such thing. Once you realize that, it's like 3B can reach all the way to A, and this, like meaning-giving thing that I think tenseless passage has to achieve can happen. Okay, so that's the idea. As I say in my reply, I think there is a snag about this, and that's what I'll talk about next. So in a nutshell, what can we be doing here? What can that mean? So when we say the passage just is, temporally perspective have a structure and all that, I mean, I told you yesterday, I think that this is sort of the reason that probably tenseless passage has kind of, well, I mean, it's at least it characterizes the reception of the tenseless passage idea on the whole. Sorry about the typo. So the label yawn-inducing, I think is Ehrman's, Watuli also cites it. If all we're doing is kind of saying, okay, look, I've got spatiotemporal relations or succession, and I'm going to call it passage. And, that's all I'm doing, and that's kind of like a relabeling of, kind of like along the lines of some of the problems we saw earlier. It's a merely linguistic move. So that's trivially true, or obviously false. If I hold on to the meaning of passage as a-theoretic, then no, I don't have it in theory. I want to briefly mention an article by Lisa Leininger in which she's very aware of this problem, because she's just written a book on tenseless passage. Now, I don't think her solution works, but it's sort of maybe instructive. The problem can also be put this way. Somehow we have to find something that time's passage can mean that's not merely B-theoretic, that's somehow almost the thing that the A-theorists have. And she says, well, it's the way that time differs from space, namely in that it involves a change in which events have become from earlier to later. And then she says stuff about relational becoming that's sort of reminiscent of Howard Stein's views. Anyway, so the idea is that an event relationally becomes, or has relationally become with respect to another event, if and only if it's in that other event's past light cone, in or on, in that event's causal past. And the problem with this, I think, is just that it just doesn't break the parity between space-time points, which is kind of is essential to the a-theoretic idea of passage. The whole idea of a transfer of metaphysical privilege means you have to have privilege first. So the problem remains, I think. Now, you could think this. Okay, if the problem is to interpret this statement, passage just is succession or something similar, couldn't you just say, the term passage is primitive, meaning it's not to be further analyzed? And I mean, I want to acknowledge that I think in some ways what I'm about to tell you has some similarities with that, but I think by itself it's a little feeble because it's like, this is the central defining statement of tenseless passage. It would be nice to say a little bit more about what's meant. Now, as you've already been hearing, it's very tempting to kind of combine tenseless passage with claims like that somehow the notional passage is incoherent or unintelligible or lacks a meaning, or it's somehow the question is not well formed, because then you can say, oh, well, it's not that, Parmenideans win and Heracliteans lose. There was no conflict to begin with. But I think that's not, as I've been telling you, I don't think Tenses passage is compatible with that for the following reason now. What we want to say in Tenses passage is that the two sides are interestingly compatible. So if we just didn't have any two sides to begin with, just a lot of people kind of talking past each other, then, I have to say, then I agree with TP's critics, and it's just a relabeling maneuver. So, in other words, I feel like in order to give TP some substance to, so to speak, give it its subject matter, something else is needed. And, okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
Have we moved beyond Ismail at this point?
Yes, and we can pause if you want.
Okay, so is what you're saying here, like Ismail isn't giving like an anemic account of passage, but you could interpret her, but that's not what her view is or shouldn't be. And then similarly, her view isn't just deflationary, because that would also not really,
thank you.
So there's some ways you could, I find it very hard to interpret what she's saying in that paper, but you're saying it's not right to interpret her claims as deflationary or as anemic passage or these kinds of things.
It kind of depends on what you mean by those terms.
Well, you told me about those terms.
So the reason the robust versus anemic distinction came about was, we were saying, that was by critics of Tenses passage. So those terms are, at least anemic has this connotation of, this is not the real thing that we wanted. And I haven't yet really told you, and maybe you won't have the sense that I tell you at all in the end what passage means for her. But so the answer to your question is it depends on what you mean. In some sense, tenseless passage is a deflationary account. You can think of it as deflationary. Whether it still is deflationary when you supplement it with ineffability, as I think it needs to be, we can come back to that. But so if you just mean, she is saying that passage is contained in the B-theoretic universe, and if that's what you mean in your passage, then yes, I'm saying that is her view. It is implicit in that paper and builds on other papers where she does similar things.
So that A theorists might think that it's anemic, but she's saying no.
Yeah, something like that. She wants it to be, She certainly doesn't want it to be just a, look, I've just relabeled this as passage. Okay. Did you want to say anything else about that? Ask, you can come back to it as well. Okay, all right. So now the aims will be to take the question of dynamicity seriously. And when you do that, I think it's quite clear that either time passes or it doesn't. Now, of course, as we've seen, there are non-standard A theories and all that. I am including that under the A theoretic umbrella. But on the whole, there is a basic decision here. And what we want is a view, or what friends of TP want, is a view that outlines a genuine alternative while taking the question seriously, but the question only has two exhaustive options. So you can see, the source of the shape of the view here. My suggestion is to embrace this either contradiction or apparent contradiction, depending on exactly how we flesh the view out. Because I think, contradictions can show up limits to sense making. So I'm going to say about time, that's what happens here. Conceptual and linguistic tools break down in this specific, well-delimited arena. So the idea is to make some room for what, of course, from an analytic standpoint looks rather mysterious, in order to contain it exactly, in this one place. And I think, so, while ineffability, this kind of thing should not be embraced lightly, I think, time is so central to well, to experience and also to various other issues in metaphysics of science that I think I'd be okay with doing that here if it can be well contained. So here's the ineffability view in a nutshell. The question is well posed. It outlines genuine possibilities for time, and it becomes salient when the nature of time is at issue in whichever discipline, or even, for the philosophizing folk. The two answers are exhaustive. There is no third way, and yet time is neither. Now, of course, already this is hard to make sense of, and at least to begin with, we can soften the appearance of contradiction a little bit, I think, by saying that these statements are not intended as an answer to the question of dynamicity so much as a reaction, because an accurate answer, is beyond the conceptual grasp on this view. Why? Well, because time's nature with respect to dynamicity is beyond the conceptual grasp. In other words, time somehow outstrips the theoretical resources in terms of which we can pose this question and develop answers. Here's an analogy. It might be helpful to think of the question as a kind of conceptual veil beyond which we cannot look, except to hypothesize that there is something beyond time, apart from its A versus B theoretic nature. So if you think of, let's say, Kantian transcendental idealism, the analogy would be, it's like the noumenon would be time as it is in itself, apart from the A or B theoretic nature, and the phenomenon would be time as it presents itself in inquiry. So what's being constituted is a sort of cognitive appearance. Not time as we experience it in Kantian idealism, but time as we're able to conceptualize it. Now, there are lots of phrases in italics here. So there's a lot to be said about how to understand those. Clearly, I can't claim to resolve the paradox of ineffability. I think that there are things that can be said to try to make this a little bit more understandable. And here's three of them. I don't think these are exhaustive, and actually I gesture towards the fourth that I'm thinking about. Each one has pros and cons, I would say. I mean, first of all, this may seem kind of out of left field, but metaphysics historically, I think, was not really that far away from theology. So let's see what theologians have come up with when they have to deal with ineffability. So what I'm thinking about here is this apathetism is an approach to religious language, whereby if you understand, if you say things like the God of Western theism, for example, is not being, is not being, all those kinds of statements. There's a certain approach to this position in theology that says ultimately this is something that needs to be interpreted as saying that these statements are not appropriate. It's not appropriate to characterize God in these terms or in these terms. These representations are not appropriate. So, we can have analogous interpretations of my italic statements along those lines. Now, of course, the question is appropriate in one sense, and why not? Clearly, the sense of inappropriateness here wouldn't be moral. Of course, if it's theoretical, then there's a strong temptation to think that must mean that they are false. And actually, on the third approach, I will talk about that's the case, all of them are false and true. But a different idea would be, one could think about the metaphor of a lack of fit. Doesn't fit time's nature. And ultimately, of course, all explanations have to come to an end. Why appropriate? Maybe the explanation can stop there. Nonetheless, I think it is a drawback that of this approach that so the idea is that we're saying something about statements about time and thereby gesturing at something about time. But you could say that the right to think that the gesture is about something concerning time has yet to be earned and hasn't been earned. So here's another approach. I mentioned transcendental idealism. So Adrian Moore actually takes transcendental idealism to be interestingly incoherent, sort of quasi-aesthetic bit of nonsense. Now, what Moore says about this is not itself supposed to be nonsense. Rather, so the idea is that there is some. So first of all, he has this distinction between knowledge that and knowledge how, and then different kinds of knowledge how, knowing know-how. Some of which he thinks we should think of as such that they can't be put into words. And now the idea is not that transcendental idealism can't be put into words, but rather that the transcendental idealist has some know-how, and such that when an attempt is made to put that know-how into words, the result is nonsense. And now, of course, the question is whether we can make sense of this, whether that can be coherent. But here's the analogy. So this is supposed to be a special kind of knowledge for which there is no question of being right or wrong. And the idea here would be, so the analogy would be, about the know-how of staying unlettered, so to speak, as I've been talking about, the know-how of, in all temporal inquiry, whether it's psychology, physics, various parts of philosophy, to know where to step back, where to stop explanations, so as to stay letter-free. And then the ineffability view from this view would be the quasi-aesthetic bit of nonsense that results from an attempt to put that know-how into words. Here's another approach or direction. This kind of just bites the bullet. A Glatt theoretic approach would embrace this self-referential contradiction at an ontic level. There are genuinely inconsistent states of affairs. Now, that is a high price to pay, and you might think too high, but on the other hand, I'm getting the sense that actually these sorts of overall deflationary meta-metaphysical positions have some affinity with dialetheism, so maybe this is a natural ally. So on that approach, each of the italicized statements would be dialetheas, both true and false. Time's nature with respect to dynamicity is both beyond the conceptual grasp and not beyond it. And finally, this is something that I'm still thinking about. Clearly, there are also Asian non-Western philosophical traditions that have a lot to do with ineffability. Early Buddhism is one obvious parallel, and another would be classical Taoism. All this is, like I say, philosophically radical, but the idea is to kind of, make use of these resources to solve a genuine kind of methodological problem in a philosophically honest way, to contain this question and the ways in which it is mysterious, and so therefore then to allow unlettered inquiry. Okay, now suppose you buy all this, what do you do with it? Suppose you're a friend of tenseless passage. So I would suggest that what we're really needing is not a new meaning for just the term passage in this slogan, but rather you need to understand this slogan holistically. It's a compressed way of saying that metaphysical theorizing reaches its limits here. And now you can say, you might wonder, if that's all the statement does, why use succession? Why not a-theoretic terms? Right? If all the succession bit and the B-theoretic sounding stuff is doing is reminding us of its limit, why not do that with a-theoretic terms? And then my answer to that would be, well, there I think it's a matter of economy, because it is true that there is this asymmetry that terms like succession and simultaneity we already need in theorizing. Whereas metaphysical privilege and objective presentness and other kinds of metaphysical machinery that atheists rely on, we do not. So overall, the answer would be talk of succession and other temporal talk becomes this placeholder, a reminder of the limits of temporal sense making. Now you might also ask, isn't that just then B theory, or like how is this a thing? How is this a thing? I don't think it's just the B theory. I think if anything, this paradoxical stuff that I'm talking about here is much more associated, has been, with the A theory. So when I present this to the philosophers of time, the atheists will say, well, don't you want to come over to our side? And it's true that there are connections. Anyway, so I don't think that it's just the B theory. I think basically the view kind of alternatingly appears as one or the other, and that's just like it should be, because that's how it is with tenseless passage too. Okay, so now, of course, I don't necessarily think that any existing friend of tenseless passage will find themselves in this description, but I think that it has various good upshots also for tenseless passage. So, for example, for Steve Savitt, at least for a while, it was important that, for example, in relativity theory, passage is thought of as a succession of local presence, right? Constituted by particular causal diamonds, namely the ones that are associated with a given point that are defined, intersections of future and past light cones on the length of a specious present or psychological present. And that's been criticized for, I think, convincing reasons by Callender and others. That looks like a sort of uncomfortable halfway house between the A and the B theory. Like, why would we need this? Why, on the one hand, we're using the psychological present, like, a B theorist might, should just think of a passage as an experience. On the other hand, we're looking for relativistic invariant structures that looks like it's an A theory, a local A theory. And, post-ineffability, we don't really need them because we're not really answering the question, like, if passage is succession, what is it then a succession of? Because, as I said, passage is succession is to be understood in this holistic manner. In other words, to put it in the context of the Ravelli article, it's not really a problem in physics. That is, he says relativity doesn't really add or subtract much with respect to the pre-relativistic debate on the reality of time. Yes, that's right. So what's outstanding isn't that the unfolding is now local, but what we ever actually could expect of theories with respect to unfolding. In other words, that we never needed an animated picture. Okay, so let me move, after a brief recap, onto the next part of the talk. So here's an overview of the 4 steps that I've been talking about. I see this conceptual indecision between B theory and meta B. I feel it myself. If you are a friend of letter freedom, as I am, the B theory obviously isn't helpful. Meta B kind of is, but it's very radical. It really mutes you on the first order level. Tenseless passage is a nicer solution. It unfortunately has this problem as it stands, therefore supplemented with ineffability. At least that's my idea. All right, so let me move on to the rest of the talk so that then we have some time for Q&A. And then you can come back to this or to... Okay, so here are some musings. I was thinking, we can kind of maybe distinguish between, let's say, a unified approach to temporal matters, which admits questions about time, full stop, or about space-time, full stop, versus a sort of piecemeal approach that admits only questions about what time is like in a given theory, according to a given theory. I think this is kind of more general, probably, than the distinction between broad and narrow approaches to space-time made in a paper by Sam Barron and Baptist. Maybe it's a little bit related. So the reason this comes up for me is, well, so lettered inquiry, the thing that I've been trying to get away from, I think is clearly unified. It asks questions that are about time, full stop, so to speak. And I mean, as I'll say in a moment, I think science is, on the whole, asks piecemeal questions. Like the piecemeal approach is more or less a scientific one. I think philosophy often can't really avoid unification, so to speak. It can't really avoid the unified approach, or it's hard to. And unification threatens, especially when one considers experience and or our ordinary spatiotemporal concepts. And now I want to relate this back to we've been talking about. So, for example, suppose you take the Wheeler-DeWitt equation to support, this is from an early reference article, the neo-Parmenidean conclusion that flies in the face of our experience as of a fleeting temporality. So I just quote this to kind of maybe relate it to some things in philosophy of temporal experience and so on. I think that's the kind of broad question or kind of broad issue, if you see it, that leads to a more unified methodology. I think a similar thing happens when you ask about ordinary concepts. So now I am very happy that you both are here, and I just want to point to this paper because I found it really interesting. I read it when preparing. So I'm thinking, as soon as we say something about our ordinary concept of space-time, that's also the kind of sort of discipline-transcendent inquiry that is arguably, part of philosophy's task, but that leads to this kind of very different methodology. So, for example, thinking about, whether on a dynamical interpretation of GR, the contingency of space-time means that space-time can be regarded as a derivative result of, and so on. I can cut this off a little bit. So the idea would be, what's piecemeal is just finding out what's the case on a dynamical interpretation of GR, but then kind of deducing from this that given our common concept of space-time, this other thing follows, that's more unified. I already said this. Okay, I want to just say one little sort of cautionary thing and see what you think about it. I think there's a certain kind of shortcut to piecemealness that I'm not so comfortable with, which is something like this, or at least I think I see this in this paper, in this certain bits. So the idea here, as I understand it, is there's an argument why there is no spatiotemporal gap problem in quantum gravity, not a severe one. And the argument has two premises, namely the only essential feature of our concept of space and time, or concept of space-time, is that the idea that space and time are locally, in some sense, distinct, is that idea that they together serve as an ordering structure locally. And then second claim, something like this holds in all current approaches to quantum gravity. Now, so this is clearly something that requires only piecemealness. This is not. And now, a certain kind of shortcut to piecemealness, so to speak, would be, for example, to say, I'm not going to worry about like essentiality claims and exactly what our concepts are about and so on. But everyone would agree that, this is a feature, whereas other features are disagreed about. I mean, my point is very basic. It's just that probably we don't just want to rest it on who actually agrees, you know, because that could change. And what we really want to assess is, I think, the quality of reasons that people have for agreeing or disagreeing, which again means that certain other, you know, parts of the literature are not as easily bracketed as you might think. I mean, this, for example, then goes on to say, in the paragraph, go on to say, you know, most marks of the spatiotemporal brought up explicitly are either acceptable as contingent or external to physics, such as tense. I mean, I'm just saying, I think ultimately just the fact that there's disagreement about this is not really, can't be the end point of that argument. We need to assess the reasons. And by the way, about Dolev, I think it's an interesting article, but probably implies that the tenses are essential, I think, to the concept of space-time. Okay, coming back to the experience as of a fleeting temporality, I think I will make this fairly quick. I mean, since you mentioned it in that reference article, and since ultimately, in some sense, I suppose the phenomena, the you know, experience is relevant, right? So in philosophy of temporal experience, there's one basic distinction that I think is helpful based on C.B. Broad, which is basically the distinction between, let's say, seeing or noticing that something has moved or has changed, let's say the hour hand of the clock, and seeing something moving or changing. And so the second thing, you know, temporal perception happens on shorter time scales. And yeah, so there's the one reason I think this literature might be relevant is what we just saw. And the other is this interpretative question that I want to tell you about a little bit in a moment, which I can sum up as follows. I think the content of positions in temporal metaphysics don't come ready-made. I think they need context, actually. And yeah, temporal experience is one of those. So, yeah, I'll just say, sorry, I will skip through some of this because we're short on time. Okay, how about this? I think maybe we come back to this if you want to in discussion, because, yeah, I think it's interesting to explore to what extent some of this might be relevant. So, you know, which bits of the philosophy of temporal experience literature are relevant, kind of, even if you, first of all, you have to decide whether you agree with this quote, of course, that the relative DeWitt equation, you know, should be understood to imply this neo-Parmenidean view, but then which bits are relevant depends on how we understand experience as of a fleeting temporality. And just briefly, there are also lots of questions about whether we really do perceive temporal features of the world. This is kind of a common starting point in the literature on temporal experience, but there have also been you know, skeptical positions on that. Okay, and let me skip to the end. This other point that I wanted to briefly tell you about. Okay, look at these claims. That's sort of orthodoxy in philosophy of time, more or less, I would say. You know, there's the A-B distinction, and then there's the question of whether or not we perceive time in an A or B theoretic way. Those are orthogonal issues, you know, one in metaphysics, one in philosophy of mind. And what I argue, amongst other things, is that actually we need to point to temporal experience to fully understand what the A theorist is positing. Finally, concluding slide. Yeah, so I think metaphysics comes into play as a bridge between disciplines, and you know, sometimes we do need to think about views of time. For example, in order to assess whether neuroscience and physicists are saying things about time that are conflicting, we probably need to talk about views of time, and that means metaphysical content is highly abstract. That means that the content is metaphysical, and that means it's abstract, but but I think there's also a certain malleability to the content. Like the context matters. All right, there was sort of some gestures at the end. Let's end it there, and then you can tell me what you want to talk about more. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, this is going to be making a little bit of... Yeah.
Yeah, so Dolev thinks tense is essential to space and time, right? That it is somehow not captured by the physical theory, right? There's nothing... Or am I getting this wrong?
No. So to be honest, this is something that I would love to discuss at greater length, to actually meet and discuss if you want. But because I don't think that all the claims in the paper are consistent, but sure, that's one way to interpret it.
Yeah, just wondering, is it supposed to be a conflict, or is this...
You mean whether I'm criticizing that what you're saying?
No. Just wondering if you're seeing this as a misinterpretation of Dolev. Maybe it is.
No. I mean, of course, you can hold both of those things. That. Well, okay. So you can think that the tenses are essential to the concept of space and time, and that they are external to physics. You can think that, of course. That is consistent. Now, I don't know if I understood you correctly. I want to hear, but I took it that you were talking about, like you were sort of saying things like tense. If Dolev is right, it's kind of external to physics, so we don't need to think about it. But the thing you're thinking about is what is essential to our concept of space-time. So I guess if that's the question, then we do need to think about it, whether it's external to physics or not.
Yeah, I don't know the context anymore.
Okay, it was.
No. I mean, not in this talk. We just.
I know.
I'm
sorry, this is kind of compressed. It's this. At least the way I understood it was part of the argument for thinking that there is no kind of huge gap between spatiotemporal concepts in classical space-time theories and non-spatiotemporal structures in quantum gravity. And then it's like, the way I saw it is as sometimes involving a sort of gesture that says, depends on what we mean. Or like what we want to mean, but we can't always decide what we mean because these terms are already in use. I guess if we're talking about the concepts, then they have some meaning already. That's my point.
I think I meant just as a simplistic, essentialist argument in a way. Really,
it would be nice if
and of course, a lot of people don't like this essentialist flavor. I understand this.
Well, I take it that you don't either. That's why you're trying to do as little as possible of it, right? It is a difficult thing.
But isn't it fair to say, to speak, first, maybe I was getting better, physics, so to speak, has certain ways of representing the world, let's say, right? And with respect to what you can represent, with what you represent in quantum physics, you have, for instance, ordering structure, you have discreteness, you have, and so on. And then out of them, a substance is really essential to, not just call, but Paul, so to speak. Space and also get these external things off the ground, including whether you have or have not, let's say, tense, that's I think. Maybe a way to bring it together, but maybe it doesn't make much sense.
No, that's cool. I also want to say this, I skipped over, but I realized that you guys have this a suggestion that we can think about how to connect the phenomenology with theories of quantum gravity in 2 steps, right? Think about first how it connects with general relativity, and then general relativity's relation to the theories of quantum gravity. I'm open to that point, and maybe that makes a difference.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very good. This is all in my case. I think our work together is more careful, so to speak, and this is less radical. And I've often been criticized here that this Geneva is too radical, and maybe it's actually.
yeah, so on the whole, I found this really interesting. I'm glad I had an occasion to read it, and yeah, I hope we can talk about it, about these kinds of things.
I'm interested in these two perspectives, the sort of unified and piecemeal approach as well, and the methodology here. And you say that you worry, there's a worry about piecemealness, presumably that it may lose the forest for the trees, that it doesn't get to, what we're interested in philosophy, what we're trying to capture by sort of focusing too narrowly on one theoretical perspective. But I think there's just as much a worry that if we go with a unified approach, that we have no reasonable theoretical grasp on what we're trying to do, and no connection to the empirical sciences, and sort of all sorts of other methodological worries come up.
Yes. And I'm sorry to find that I didn't make this very clear, and it's not at all surprising. I like piecemealness. That is what I think TP gives me. Although by a very unified route, I understand the ineffability stuff looks really unified, or that's probably why you're saying that. I like piecemealness. I don't think, losing forest for the trees. I mean, what I say about philosophy here, it's just, I find the piecemealness is nice. We understand that, and it's kind of a very solid ground. I just find that I find it's often difficult to avoid a sort of pull back to unification. And I wanted to put up these quotes to say why.
Good, yes, and I think that is exactly right. I mean, a naturalist could say something like, well, there really only is a piecemeal approach. Anything else isn't methodologically serious. And of course, part of the piecemealness will have to be that we sort of contextualize or consider the status of the theoretical context in which we're trying to address certain of these questions. So it's not just, trying to figure out whether theoretical conceptions of the temporal metaphysics are compatible with relativity theory or whatever in a particular theoretical context, say relativity theory or something like that, but also about but what's the status of that theoretical context as well. Okay. Sort of, and that is a form of taking, if you want, a more unified view, or maybe it's not quite the unified view, but you do sort of take a step beyond the theoretical context itself, in that you try to sort of get a sense of, of the sort of the trustworthiness, maybe in some sense of that context, and maybe the limitations of it as well. Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, we agree that there are these pulls towards unification, maybe for good reason, and it's okay. It's just something to watch out for, maybe. That's all I'm saying here. Yeah.
On the point of piecemeal, to some extent, I understand the difference, right? Piecemealness has achieved a lot in our understanding of things like space and time. But I think if we go too piecemeal, then we lose the ground for the meaningfulness of these concepts at all, which kind of grow out of or nourish by the Lebenswelt, if you will. And so I don't think we can lose grasp of the original philosophical questions or its significance, or the stuff we're doing in the high-level theory stuff just loses its meaning entirely. It's just it's a variable T that we know what it means because we live here in the world, but we pretend that we don't when we're working in a theoretical context. I think this is to be avoided too, so I don't think we can be full-on piecemealers.
Yeah, since I know we've talked a lot about this, I understand exactly what you mean. I don't know if I want to go as far as you in the direction of why unification often threatens, but yeah, that's the kind of thought. That's the kind of cautionary note, I suppose. Yeah. we know what these things mean. And maybe the ineffability view, can be seen as a sort of, it's like my way of saying as little as possible about, okay, we know what it means, but maybe it can't be put into words in a very methodologically satisfying way. So I'm trying to say as little as possible, so as a placeholder to slot that stuff in.
I don't think you can stop there.
Okay. I know.
I want to react to everything you said and all the discussions, so let me try to. So, for the piecemeal thing, I think in the paper we're talking about the concept of space-time.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the idea that there is disagreement between people about what they mean by space-time. Some people think that space-time has to be relativistic.
Right.
Some people have a more broader notion, but
yes.
to me, I'm agnostic. I don't know what to do. Probably I will have the same view on the broader application.
Yeah. So the way I thought of this is that this is clearly a different distinction. It's like about methodology, whereas these views of space-time, but I thought it was worth mentioning because maybe there's some points of connection.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, it's, maybe. Sorry.
No.
When you say so tell me again. Your distinction was the broad versus narrow. It's the narrow one is that space-time has to be relativistic. Is that right?
Usually, some people might think that basically you can be say monist or pluralist, but either you think there is one correct concept of space-time, which is the one built by Minkowski and people, and space-time is indexed to that. But you can also be a very pluralist or liberal, like a 3+1 structure with two manifolds, you can call that space-time too, and have literal space-time. That people have different intuitions, and it was kind of, we were talking about that to try to put on the side the debate about what's the correct definition of space-time.
Right.
I told you, there is no way you're able to solve that because there is disagreement.
Yeah. So then actually, maybe the right thing to say is not that there's similarities between these distinctions, they're kind of orthogonal. It's more like, given my methodological distinction, I might feel licensed to ask, whose concept are we talking about? Is it everyone's or particular people's? But you're talking about, it's just a different thing, I think, there, yeah.
It's a finger, or can I?
Yeah, a little bit evil, but no.
I'm just going to say two very quick things on different topics.
I guess what we say about this essentialist / minimalist space, so this is what you were discussing, right? Minimalist, I think, space-time.
The minimalist
conception. It's not just something everyone would agree on, but then disagree on the rest, and that's a bit more interesting. No, but it's already does all the work you need, arguably, to have all this kind of explanatory machinery of, say, reduction, functional reduction, like Chris and Nick, they would disagree with this, by the way, that they from here that you have this, but so this right, okay. The issue of diachronicity, for instance, right? It doesn't occur anymore once you have the minimals
that's the same. I have the same question. Like, whose concept is at issue in that dispute? Like, whose concept do you need the minimalist conception to satisfy? Maybe it's not ours because you don't want to connect all the way to phenomenology and our ordinary full concepts because you have this two-step thing. Yeah.
I think it's a nice concept that Niels found that you have the concept of space-time. You have space-time when you have a split between space-like and time-like things. That would be one concept of space-time. But I would not want to, for me, I would not want to commit to the fact that that's the correct concept of space-time.
See, so this is the thing. This is the point at which I then want to know how to understand that first premise. Because if we're just pluralist about it and just say, okay, this is one thing you could count as essential, but I'm not going to commit to that it is essential, then it's like, okay, but I can also not do that, right? So like at some point you do want to say, this is essential to some concept that is relevant to your project.
And
I guess it can be functionalist at the phenomenological level, but that is, I know, can I say, so I just want to, because you mentioned several things, I want to first give my view on how these things relate, and then ask you about something, I think, so I guess this idea of explanatory or conceptual gap between the non-spatial temporal and spatial temporal. The way I think about that is like, okay, you're a B theorist at the level of GR, you reduce A concepts to B theoretical concepts. But then you have a problem that at the fundamental level, you don't even have enough structure to have relations of ordering or something like that. So you need another step. I'm myself quite sympathetic to B theory of time in general, but also in terminology to what you called tenseless passage. I kind of like what Callender or you mentioned. But I was wondering, so you mentioned two options. So I guess I'm a lazy
tenseless passage person?
Yeah, because I think I can stop there, but I'm happy to try to think more about that. And I think that you mentioned two options, right? One is primitive notions, the other ineffability.
Right.
And you suggested them as two different possibilities. And I was thinking maybe there is a nice way to put them together.
Go on.
In relation to the Buddhist stuff as well.
Yeah.
Say something like, okay, you have to stop and have primitive notions at some point. And if you try to explain the primitive notions, you will run into cycles and you will be bordering, in some sense, ineffability. So I was thinking, do you have any ideas about having them as a package deal?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, look, I did want to say that there are similarities, and I'm not in a position to say, oh, you have to do me an analysis of this, given my view. I just feel like if that's all, if the idea is just, this term is primitive, then I feel like, because that's the central slogan, I really haven't told my interlocutor what tenseless passage is. Like, there's a central term, it's just undefined, especially since there's such a salient meaning that doesn't work. Atheoretic passage. But I like that connection, and I'm interested that you see that connection. I think I see that too, and I would like to talk more about what you said about the.
I've been influenced by Geneva-Yonsei, this idea of primitive notions. You understand them at the explanatory work they do, and in a way, I think like you can think of that. Okay, you can understand the primitive notion of passage by thinking how it's used to explain things. But if you want to go in the other direction, you try to find something relatively more fundamental and explain that, then you clash with ineffability in some sense.
Interesting. I want to think more about that too. Let me just say one thought that comes up for me right now. I guess the way that I think of the term, it's by its use. But I think it's already, so the term passage is understood through its use, and I think its use is determined first by lots of metaphysical machinery. I feel that it's important to say at the beginning, what am I talking about? The Feinean framework gives you one way to say it, other frameworks, metaphysical privilege being transferred, and then I think there's also a gesture to temporal experience. And unfortunately, of course, that meaning that's determined and fixed in that way doesn't work. That makes it for a trivially false slogan. And so then the question is it okay to say, well, I don't mean that, but I mean something else, and I'm not going to tell you anything else about, because you can't go deeper. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for this sympathetic suggestion and for your questions. That's good. I think I got us back on time. Do you think? I skipped some stuff.
Yeah. If we stop here.
I
I like being on time.
There's something to be said in favor of being in time. Okay, so thank you very much.